Well, thank you very much, Brad. We appreciate you sharing your thoughts with us. It's definitely thought-provoking. So does this mean this is the start of your presidential campaign?
No.
So
I am the president of Microsoft. I'm going to campaign for it.
So you're already a president. That may be a better job anyway. So today you called for two things, more public regulation and a stronger sense of corporate responsibility on the part of technology companies. So I want to push you on each of those two things. So focusing first on the legislative and regulatory angles. So you outlined several new requirements: more company transparency on the capabilities and limitations of the technology, third-party testing, addressing discrimination, meaningful public notice when facial recognition is being deployed. So these changes we can imagine taking place at the city, state, or national levels. Where do you think people should be focusing their activism? Which levels represent the most promising opportunities for action?
I think it's a fascinating question, and of course, when it comes to Washington, D.C., I think one rightly asks the U.S. Congress to consider moving forward, and we do. This is not the most complicated issue that this or the next Congress will have to address, and I think it is appropriate for federal legislation. But in this country especially, I think we often appreciate that the states, or sometimes these days the municipalities, are the incubators of new ideas. And so we're hopeful, in fact, that we'll see new privacy legislation passed in the next 2 years here in Washington, D.C., and we would advocate that the Congress include a chapter on facial recognition in a new privacy law. But I think we might see action even faster in one or more states. And what is really interesting when you think about these issues is to think about them with one particular distinction in mind. Some of these issues, like the protection of democratic freedoms, like the protection of people's privacy in, say, commercial spaces, really needs to be thought about everywhere. It's going to be something that's important in every jurisdiction, not just in the United States, but around the world. But think about the proposal I outlined when it comes to transparency and enabling third parties to test technology. We don't actually need to get that passed everywhere. We just need to get it passed somewhere that matters. Because if a state that has enough clout in this technology space passes, for example, that kind of transparency and testing requirement, then the tech companies that are likely to say, okay, I want to participate in that state, or maybe I'm headquartered in that state, if I want to be in this business, I have to make the data available. And once the data is available somewhere, the data is available everywhere. This is something that we learned from our own experience from technology regulation in Brussels over the years, and it actually means that we can get this market working in a healthy way really quickly. And so one of the things that we're hopeful that we'll see in 2019 is a state of significance in this context, or perhaps a collection of cities, move forward, and the market will be healthier as a result.
Okay, so I'd like to ask about some other possibilities for legislation that some consumer groups have endorsed. So one idea is to limit data usage in regard to facial recognition in particular to the initial purpose. So meaning that you may go to the airport may collect your facial image in order to safeguard security, but they should not be transferring that image to other venues for other purposes. Should we favor that?
I think that that is a great question that, frankly, deserves a robust discussion. It's one of these things that, frankly, we thought about, and as you can see, we offered a more limited step. But like I said, we don't offer any of these steps saying, oh my gosh, we are the ones who necessarily have the world's best answer. I think that there are a variety of scenarios, and the image that I showed you of Delta at an airport, in fact, the sign they say, basically that right there says this image isn't going to be preserved. So by definition, they would comply with what you're saying. There are scenarios where one might say, it should only be used for that specific purpose and for a limited period of time. There might be other scenarios where you would want the ability to get somebody's consent in a broader manner. And yeah, I generally favor opportunities for people to be notified and give extra consent. But I think it's also more than appropriate to talk through, well, what are the extra protections to make sure that that consent is real, that people have a choice, that it's really informed. So yeah, I think that there's frankly a lot that we're going to learn, certainly at Microsoft, I suspect across the tech sector from consumer groups and the civil liberties community as these kinds of issues evolve.
So a couple of other possibilities. Some people have suggested the ability to be able to correct your data if you can show the data are inaccurate. And then secondly, the right to be forgotten, which of course you will recognize from the European Union General Data Protection Regulations, storing facial images only for a certain period of time. What are your views on those things?
I think one should put these kinds of issues in the context of what is rapidly becoming a broader privacy discussion in the United States. We as a company, I as a leader of our company, came to Washington, D.C. In 2005, 13 years ago. I gave a speech where I said we thought the time had come for national privacy legislation in the United States. I didn't give it at the Brookings Institution, I gave it on Capitol Hill, and maybe that was the mistake because nobody listened. We are 13 years later, and I actually think that one of the good things about the year 2018 is it's great. We're seeing companies like Apple and Salesforce and others say, no, now is the time. We do need national privacy laws. And one may want to tease apart some of these issues, but as a general matter, the kinds of rights that individuals have today in Europe, say the right to access your data, the right to correct your data if it's wrong, the right to delete your data, the right to take your data and move it to another provider. We are the only tech company this year, when the new regulation took effect in Europe on the 25th of May, that said we're going to take all of these rights that these individuals have in Europe, and we're actually going to make these rights available to all of our customers everywhere in the world. And so we've been living since the 25th of May with this kind of approach. And there's been one piece of learning that I think has been really, really interesting and even a little bit surprising. Since the end of May, 2 million citizens in the European Union have exercised their rights on Microsoft services. 2 million people in a union with 500 million people. In the United States, the number isn't 2 million, it's 3. 3 million Americans in a country that is smaller in terms of population than the EU. I think that tells us something. It tells us that Americans care about privacy. And this almost mantra that one heard in the tech sector 5 or 10 years ago, that privacy was dead and that people didn't care about it, should be dispelled as a myth. It is a myth, in my view. People do care about privacy. It deserves to be protected in this country. And we'll have to work through some of the specifics along the lines you mentioned. But I think Americans deserve a high level of privacy protection. We'll need to work through nuances. You always do, especially as we think about where AI and access to data is going, as we think about issues like anonymization and the like. But I think in the privacy field writ large, it's time for us to get moving.
So I'd like to move to the corporate responsibility angle. So we know the U.S. is pretty libertarian in its approach to technology innovation. Companies have quite a bit of leeway in terms of what products they introduce and how and when they do that. Now, you suggest companies, especially in the tech sector, should exercise more self-restraint and should not always commercialize products to the full extent that is possible. So the question I have, is this really viable in a competitive marketplace where you may decide not to sell facial recognition to law enforcement, somebody else is going to?
Well, we live in a year when expectations for the tech sector have grown. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I get to work with people not just at Microsoft, but across the tech sector. And I don't meet bad people, I don't meet thoughtless people, but I often meet people who work at places where it's hard to get decisions made. And when you're at a company, it's sometimes easy to just keep going in the same direction that you started, unless somebody makes a decision to change course. And we're at a time when a course correction, in my view, is clearly needed in many areas of technology. And so I think that the broader public conversation that we're having is helping us all to learn more, to be introspective. Little humility definitely never hurt anybody, in my view. It's a time when people are having to make some decisions. And so I think it's good to encourage companies to be more decisive on this and other issues. I do believe at the end of the day that there's one decision that you can easily persuade every company that has even the smallest dose of responsibility to make, and that is the decision to comply with the law. And so let's get the law in place. We'll get everybody on this new floor. We can then talk about the world as a whole. We can talk about the competition that may come from companies in other countries that won't have a law like ours. We can talk about making our case, frankly, and appealing to the hearts and minds of consumers in other parts of the world where I think people care about the protection of privacy, the rights of the individual. This is a time when I think those issues not only should matter, but do, and we need to be able to act more effectively to address them.
So I'd like to ask you about racial and gender biases, which of course you referenced in your talk. And we know that there are higher inaccuracy rates for racial minorities and women based on unrepresentative training data. And there actually was a very sobering example of this summer when facial recognition was applied to minority members of Congress, and it inaccurately concluded that some of them were convicted felons. Now, if this were the whole Congress, that might actually be accurate.
Not convicted, not convicted.
By the way, that's my comment, that's not his comment. But these were minority legislators. So should there be some minimum level of accuracy required before we put technology like this into widespread use? And if there is a misidentification, what recourse should the affected person have? Again,
a great set of questions. And what I put forward on behalf of Microsoft is something that we think says, let's move quickly and get the market working, and then we'll see if the market can address this problem. I do think it is a real issue that needs to be addressed. I'm actually encouraged by the technology advances that we've even seen this year. So there is real progress. Some of the problems relate, especially in the past, to issues around data sets not being as large or as comprehensive as they need to be, and people are more sensitive to that. People are developing new technical approaches to address issues around data sets, that you can build a data set and complement it through simulation technology and the like, so I think that's interesting. Frankly, one of the things that gives me just a bit of pause is that when I read something like the NIST study that came out a couple of weeks ago, it tested 127 algorithms from 45 companies. But there are some companies that didn't make their algorithms available for testing. And so that's why I think it's important to have an approach that gets all of this data made available, and let's see where we are. Rather than take 5 years to debate the issue and then impose more absolute requirements, let's see if the right combination of law and market incentives can solve this problem in a couple of years. If not, then we may need more protections.
So I have one more question, then we'll open the floor to questions from the audience. So in your talk, you mentioned George Orwell's book, 1984. I have a personal angle on this. My wife is an actress, and literally this summer, she performed in a theatrical rendition of this very play. So of course, I had read this book many years ago, but I have to say this summer, it was quite eerie to see the play now after the advent of facial recognition software, advances in artificial intelligence, and of course, the spread of video cameras to every major city around the world. So, what seemed to be a dystopian abstraction in 1949, when Orwell first published that book, seems a lot more concrete now. So, I'm thinking about mass surveillance and the possible threats there. You mentioned that we need legislation that would prohibit government agencies from using facial recognition to engage in surveillance on specific individuals unless there was a court order or an emergency involving imminent danger. So how would that operate, and what do you think would be needed to actually implement that type of rule for U.S. government agencies?
I don't think it needs an extraordinarily leap forward in the way that the law works. The first thing I would note is that when you read Chief Justice Roberts' opinion in the Carpenter case, you almost have to ask yourself, if a law enforcement agency implemented this tomorrow and an individual were arrested based on the information obtained by following that person around, and that individual went to court, would that individual win a case before the Supreme Court under the Fourth Amendment? It was a 5-4 court. But interestingly and importantly in this context, it was not a 5-justice majority that relied on Justice Kennedy. I actually think that there would be certain grounds for optimism that the Supreme Court would protect that right. And in the same way that law enforcement has adapted, first earlier this decade to recognize that law enforcement couldn't put physically a GPS locator on a car, and has now said that the law enforcement can't go to the telecommunications company and obtain the cell location records. Instead, they have to do what law enforcement knows full well how to do. It's called go to court and ask for a warrant. That we would begin to implement that in these particular contexts as well. There's two things that I just think are worth keeping in mind from a broader perspective. The first is Orwell's book. I think that the best way to avoid a problem is sometimes to be able to see it very clearly. And that is one of the services that great literature does for the world. And it's what Orwell did for the world. And when you read that book through the eyes of 2018, you realize that world is now possible, but it's not inevitable. And the other thing that really inspires me, frankly, is when I read the opinions of Chief Justice Roberts in the Carpenter case and in the Riley case against California from a few years ago. Because for him, there's a work of literature. It was a letter. It was the letter written by Abigail Adams, or really to Abigail Adams, by John Adams on the 3rd of July, 1776. And in that letter, Adams remembered a trial that had taken place in Boston in 1761 when the British government started using these general warrants to go from house to house. And Otis lost his case. But it was that loss that in many ways, Adams said, inspired the colonists to pursue these rights. And Adams, to the day he died, said that really it was that day, that case, that courtroom that set the nation on a course for independence. So we'll all have to work through where do the commas go in sentences and new statutes. But if you can remember one future that was painted by George Orwell and say that's the future we want to avoid, and if we can remember this vision from the past that made this country what it became and what it has always been, I think those kinds of things, frankly, play a really important role in helping us, for our generation, find the right path.
Okay, let's open up the audience to questions. Right here on the aisle, there's a woman, and there's a microphone coming over. We would just ask you to ask a question as opposed to giving a counter speech.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. I was wondering how you plan to use the position of Microsoft to advocate for these kinds of changes in Congress, and also bringing other tech companies into the fold of advocating for it, educating those who might be against it, such as law enforcement organizations or other companies. We won't name any names. And then have you already reached out to any House or Senate offices or other offices you'd like to see take the lead on this initiative? Thank you.
Yes, and yes. I would say.
Okay, next question, please.
Yeah. We've been talking with other tech companies, the trade associations, the civil liberties groups, the privacy groups, the consumer groups, law enforcement groups. This needs to come together around a big table with a seat for everybody. We've been talking to a number of people. I've been talking with people, senators and members of Congress. We've been talking to people in certain state capitals. And we've been working with legislators on the drafting of legislative language. And so we hope that things can start to move. And look, as you all know, you live here every day. I visit. You don't get anything done without people coming together, without ensuring that everybody's voice is heard, without finding certain paths to compromise, especially when one is talking about legislation. I always think one needs to be a little bit more circumspect or sober these days in Washington, D.C., just because it's a decade when it's proven generally difficult to get things passed. I'm hopeful that we'll see Congress act, but I'm probably more optimistic that if something's going to happen in the first half of 2019, it may happen in a state capital or even in a municipality, and that's okay, because that will put us on the path ultimately to national legislation.
And if I can add just one quick footnote to what Brad said. A couple months ago, I addressed the Midwestern Governors Association, and I can tell you, people at the state level are really engaged in these issues. They're thinking about them. Of course, they're interested in the economic development aspects of technology, but they can also see a warning signs, just based on everything we read in the newspaper today. So I think there's a lot of interest at every level of government. I think there's a question here.
Do I have to stand? Do I stand? Okay. So I have a question. Thank you for coming to Brookings. Thanks for talking about this. And shameless plug, we have a paper coming out on algorithmic bias shortly. So good to see you talk about that. So legislation is normally put out there to reduce consumer harm, right? But given, and you said this, the nascent nature of this technology, alongside what Daryl mentioned, the insufficient training data. There's been great studies at MIT around the recognition of darker skin hues when it comes to facial recognition data. And then the general broader conversation that we're talking about with AI around fairness, accuracy, and the long conversation around digital due process. Would it be more appropriate to do more of a multi-stakeholder engagement process around this first before we push for legislation? So I'm just really curious about that, because will we be kind of putting this out, the cart before the horse, when we should maybe be bringing civil society, corporations, and others together to figure out those use cases?
Well, I would say a couple of things. First, I think that the art of legislation is, by definition, a multi-stakeholder process. Legislation doesn't get passed, certainly in the United States or in Europe or other places, without multi-stakeholder engagement. So the real question is not whether one should pass a law without multi-stakeholder engagement, but whether we can move both of these things forward at the same time. And from our vantage point, we think that the market can work well if it's well informed, if there's a level of transparency, and if there is this ability for third-party testing in an appropriate way. And so, look, this isn't the world's biggest, heaviest cart that we're trying to build here. That would be one of the points I would make. I think that if anything, others will say, we need a bigger cart. And so we would say, well, let's start with a few carts that are reasonably sized for the circumstances, and then we can continue to learn. I am by no means here to say that this is the one and only law that anyone's ever going to need to pass. But I do believe that if this law is passed soon, then we may solve some of these problems more quickly, and then we'll all be much better informed in the context of multi-stakeholder engagement, to then think about and talk together about what might come next.
So I think there's a question over here, the gentleman on the end, Chris.
Thank you so much for the great presentation. You spoke at length today about the need to prevent states from abusing facial recognition technology. In the past, you've also spoken and written quite thoughtfully about why the technology sector needs to engage more with the Pentagon and U.S. military. I was wondering if you could share some of your thoughts on how facial recognition technology might be used by the military, or should be. Is that a separate sphere, or do your 6 principles still apply there?
It's a really good question, and I guess the first thing I would say is we're all learning, and certainly we are continuing to learn. Certainly there are scenarios where one could deploy facial recognition in military use. Certainly, when you think about aircraft, whether they're piloted or whether they're drones and they're piloted by people on the ground. People are trying to identify certain individuals at times, say terrorists and the like. And we would certainly say that these kinds of principles deserve some very serious attention and need to be addressed. You certainly don't want to make decisions that are inaccurate, based on misidentification or bias. And I don't think that as a society, we're broadly comfortable in that kind of scenario. For example, letting machines make these decisions. So this whole notion of meaningful human review is really of vital importance. And so in the tech sector, there have been some well-publicized situations where employees have expressed concern about the use of artificial intelligence by the militaries of the world. And one of the things I find in listening to our employees is that it's good to listen to our employees. It doesn't mean that we cede the decision making. I mean, we obviously made a very different decision from Google when it came to artificial intelligence in the military. But we didn't say one thing, we said two. And so far, no other tech company has said these two things or said them together. We said we will make our technology, including artificial intelligence, available to the United States military, but we will engage not just actively, but proactively as citizens to address these issues, to talk them through, to advocate for appropriate laws. And I think we're learning a lot, even though it's really very early days. I think we're learning that we all have to figure out what the issues are. I find, especially when you put AI together with military scenarios, the first thing we have to do is identify all the questions, and I don't think we have yet. I mean, when we published the blog I wrote in July, we at least were able to say, here's 7 or 8 questions. And I feel like we're still assembling the questions societally in this space. I also think that the United States military has this incredible tradition of thinking deeply about ethics. And I find it really interesting that you cannot graduate from West Point or Annapolis, for example, without taking a course in ethics. But unless you attend Georgia Tech, you can get a degree in computer science from one of the 10 leading universities in this country in this field without having to take a course in ethics. So I actually think it's a moment when we should recognize that we in the technology sphere have new questions to bring to, say, the military, and we have things that we can learn together. And I frankly think that I hope that a decade from now, the computer science departments of the universities of this country will have an ethics in artificial intelligence or an ethics in computing course as a required course for the computer and data scientists of tomorrow. So I would say more than anything, we have a lot of work to do, and we're going to do our best work if we do it together and in a way where we get to listen to and learn from each other.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. There's a lady right here. If you can bring the microphone over to her. We'll give you the last question, so it has to be a really, really good question. So.
Thank you so much, Katie Wang with NTD TV. My question is about China, because we know nowadays China is actively using this artificial intelligence in the society surveillance and repression. And as you are also operating in this market, how can you protect your own customers, the privacy, and apply these principles that you have mentioned about, and also how to protect your technology from being used by or stolen or forced to be used by those totalitarian regimes? Yeah, thank you.
Let me say 2 things. First, I'll answer a question without talking about China per se, and then I'll talk about China per se. The truth is we look around the world, and one of our 6 principles is about where we're comfortable having our technology deployed by the state, by governments. And that's a global principle. And there are, without naming any specifics, there are definitely countries where we are and will not be comfortable providing our artificial intelligence technology to governments, especially for uses where they could be, for example, put to work for ongoing or mass surveillance, or other scenarios where we believe people's human rights would be at risk. And there's work that we've turned down. There are deals that we've turned down in some parts of the world where governments have wanted to license our technology, and we just were not comfortable that it would be deployed in a way that would protect people's human rights. So we'll continue to apply that principle on a global basis. And look, we should keep in mind there are days when people have concerns about the protection of human rights or civil liberties here in the United States too. So, no single country has a monopoly on either end of this spectrum. This is something we need to think about quite thoughtfully and globally. And then I do think that there is a global conversation that is going to need to be had. Artificial intelligence technology is not the repository of a single company or a single country. I think people generally perceive that there are certain countries that are in a stronger leadership position. The United States, I would say, and I think most people would say, is in the leadership position. And I think most people would say, and I would say, that China is in a very impressive position as well, number two. And when we think about ethical issues for artificial intelligence, we need to find our way to a global discussion. Now, I don't say that with this any naive sense that this is the easiest issue for people around the world to sit down and come to an agreement. But it needs to be on the table. It needs to be part of the conversation. And I think especially when we look at the governments and the consumers of Europe or Canada or Japan or South Korea or Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, many other places, I think they're going to be watching. And I think that's a good thing. I believe that if we can pursue a responsible path and we can take a path that really commits to protect people, and people know it, then they can choose. And I believe that the people of Europe and Canada and these other places are going to want to choose technology that comes from companies that have high standards of protection for people. So I welcome that kind of conversation, and I also respect that there are rich philosophical traditions all around the world, and we need to really engage with each other to talk these through.
Brad, thank you very much. Lots for all of us to think about. So please join me in thanking.
Thank you. Thanks for coming.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.